Just before we get into the video today, I do want to talk about the perfect blend of style and functionality with today's fantastic sponsor, Ridge. You see, at Ridge, they build gear that is designed to last for life, and their latest creation is no exception. This is the Ridge beveled ring set. It's perfect for anyone who wants a ring that can keep up with their busy lifestyle. So what makes these rings stand out from the crowd? Well, first off, they come in a variety of premium materials, from carbon fiber to 24 karat gold. Plus, they've got an outer beveled edge, so you've got on-hand comfort, and they've got this inner convex shape, so you've got a pinch-free, comfortable fit. It just fits lovely. And that's not all. They've also launched silicone rings that are available in multiple colors, like matte, olive, royal black. Trying to get my royal black one out of here right now. Alpine grey, gunmetal, and base camp orange. Just like the metal rings, it also comes with a silicone band and a travel case. It's all about versatility. And Ridge offers lost and resizing protection. Whether you lose your ring or shed a few pounds, or maybe gain a few pounds, you could exchange your ring for the same style in a different size, not once but twice. Plus, Ridge uses the same premium materials and designs from their signature wallet. So if you've got a Ridge wallet, why not complete the look with a matching Ridge ring? So if you want to upgrade your star game and add that finishing touch to your look, head on over to Ridge using the link below, or go to ridge.com/shadows and get a fantastic 10% discount with the promo code SHADOWS. Big thank you to Ridge for sponsoring. And now, today's video. So, how do you quickly inform someone that lethal, invisible beams of energy are nearby and could fry every cell in their body, and unbeknownst to them, have already handed them a death sentence? This is the radioactive symbol, or more precisely, it's the symbol posted on various devices, containers, and substances, warning of ionizing radiation, which is extremely harmful to the human body. The symbol is also placed at the perimeter of nuclear power plants, former bomb test sites, and areas that have experienced a catastrophic nuclear meltdown where radiation levels are dangerously high, even when standing at a distance of several hundred feet, or perhaps even a couple of miles. The radioactive symbol was first devised in 1946 in the US, and it slowly became adopted as the standard international hazard symbol for ionizing radiation between 1963 and 1974, officially being designated with the International Standards Organization number 361. Its trefoil shape is supposed to represent 3 blasts of radiation coming off of an atom. If we hadn't seen this symbol a billion times in movies, TV shows, and comic books, I'm not sure how many of us would have been able to figure out that these geometric shapes represented radiation from an atom, or immediately realize the extreme danger it posed in time to save our lives, or at the very least spare ourselves permanent injury and some agonizing weeks in hospital. Similarly, popular knowledge of the radioactive symbol is not equally distributed around the world. A survey conducted in India, Brazil, and Kenya in 2004 found that only 6% of respondents understood its meaning and the danger that it signified. As such, rods made of highly radioactive material have engravings on them that are even more blunt. The most recognizable on the internet being a rod of Cobalt-60, only an inch thick, that could fit into the palm of your hand. The engraving reads, "Danger, radiation, drop and run." If you held one of these fully irradiated rods for 5 minutes, eventually your hand would swell up like a balloon, large strips of skin would probably turn necrotic and fall off, and the massive amount of radiation that hit the rest of your body would give you a 50-50 chance of dying in the next 2 months. If you held onto a fully irradiated rod of Cobalt-60 for 10 minutes, you'd soon vomit, soil yourself with a heavy bout of diarrhea, have multiple seizures, fall into a coma within the hour, and be dead in 2 days. Therefore, drop and run is something of an understatement. You should drop it and run for your goddamn life until you are the better part of a mile away, or at least until there are some very heavy walls between you and the object. However, to be frank, it'd be wise to keep running all the way to the emergency room. Given that the world's largest supplier of Cobalt-60 rods is Canada, and that the international language of science is English, even this sinister warning might be missed by people who can't read English engravings and aren't terribly familiar with the concept of radioactivity. There are numerous cases from the developing world where people unwittingly dismantled nuclear devices and died horrible deaths. As such, in 2007, the International Atomic Energy Agency unveiled a supplementary radiation warning, ISO symbol 21482. It is meant to be pasted on nuclear devices in addition to the classic radioactive symbol. If a person ignores the trefoil symbol on the outside of this device and begins to dismantle it, once they lift a panel or remove an outer casing, they will be confronted by a much more insistent blood red triangle with the classic radiation symbol at the top. But this time, the radiation symbol is emitting sinister lines of nuclear energy down towards a skull and crossbones representing high toxicity and death. And next to it, there's a man running for his life. As such, ISO 21482 is the international symbol of stop whatever the hell you're doing and get out of there, and if you're lucky, you haven't already signed your own death warrant. Due to the immense danger posed by radiation to human beings and the catastrophes that inevitably follow when radioactive materials are unleashed upon the public, everything in our power must be done to keep unsuspecting people away from them. And this brings us to the tragic event which convinced international authorities the run for your damn life symbol was desperately needed around the world. And that's the Samut Prakan radiation accident. And just before we get into that horror show, I do want to give a plug for this book, The Shortest History of the Universe, written by the author of today's episode, David Baker. I've read this book. It's a fantastic book. As you can probably tell from the title, it's The Shortest History of the Universe, and it is amazing what it condenses into just such a short read, from the Big Bang to us existing today, and then a pretty wild look into what the future of humanity and the universe might be. It's an excellent read. I'd highly recommend it. There is a link below, and let's get into the horror show, shall we? Samut Prakan is a province included in the Bangkok metropolitan area of the Southeast Asian kingdom of Thailand. It is a heavily urbanized region with well over 1 million people living on top of each other. And it was in this crowded area that in February of the year 2000, a source of tremendous radioactivity was left in a junkyard, sparking a state of emergency and endangering the local populace. The seeds of the disaster were sown several decades earlier in 1969, when the German technology conglomerate Siemens exported a radiotherapy machine to a hospital in Bangkok. The machine used targeted radiation to induce cell death and shrink malignant tumors that would otherwise continue to grow rapidly, impeding a patient's bodily functions and ultimately killing them. The machine in question was powered by a rod of Cobalt-60, which had been produced in Canada. Cobalt-60 is a radiation source that is not found in nature. It must be artificially made. Plain old naturally occurring cobalt is usually extracted as a byproduct of nickel and copper mining, and when extracted from the ore, it can be smelted into a bluish-grey metal. Historically, cobalt was used to infuse a splash of blue in everything from ancient Roman jewelry to Chinese Ming vases. In the modern age, cobalt is instead frequently shipped to heavy-water nuclear plants like those in Canada, where it is bombarded with neutrons in order to fill the nucleus of a cobalt atom with more of them, going from 27 neutrons to 33. This process of neutron enrichment takes the relatively stable blue metal and transforms it into a highly unstable radioactive one called an isotope. A neutron-laden isotope decays by emitting tremendous amounts of energy into the surrounding environment as it tries to settle into a more stable form again. This fierce blast of energy is called ionizing radiation. That's the deadly kind of radiation. It's strong enough to strip electrons from the shell surrounding an atom. It's sort of like taking a sharp pick or a knife or a piece of steel wool and scraping the enamel off your teeth. As such, in living cells, ionizing radiation can have a hugely unhealthy and destabilizing effect on the body's complex and fragile patchwork of interwoven parts. It can create horrific swollen burns and skin necrosis, aka dead flesh that's still attached to your body. It can also destroy parts of your DNA, the very fiber of your being, creating grotesque mutations and vastly increasing the risk of cancer. It can also destroy the marrow of your bones, which stops the production of white blood cells necessary to fight off viruses and hostile bacteria, meaning that the smallest of infections can kill you. It also destroys your gastric, vascular, neurological systems, causing intense nausea, vomiting, bloody diarrhea, unbearable abdominal pain, fever, the shutting down of vital organs, disorientation, seizures, and ultimately death. Once blasted by a significant dose of ionizing radiation, there is often a period of initial nausea, followed by a latency period of several days where you show few symptoms. Meanwhile, the cells of your body will quietly contort and curdle until the whole fragile system breaks down and you suddenly become tremendously ill. Without medical treatment, you will almost certainly die, and if you got a heavy dose, it doesn't matter if you got medical treatment. You're gonna die anyway. In small targeted doses, via radiotherapy machines, ionizing radiation can do just enough damage to living cells that it slowly shrinks cancerous tumors. But if its full power is unleashed upon the world, it is a horrific thing to behold. No different than the fallout experienced by the people at Hiroshima and the people at Nagasaki. And these devices are in almost every hospital around the globe. As such, the rod of Cobalt-60 used in the Bangkok radiotherapy machine was housed inside a thick container made out of lead, a metal that is capable of stopping ionizing radiation dead in its tracks. The lead container was surrounded by stainless steel. Because the rod of Cobalt-60 was only an inch thick and 1.5 inches long, the lead and steel container was also quite small, about 17 inches long and 8 inches wide. But due to all the heavy metals involved, the whole thing weighed an astonishingly hefty 230 pounds. Over time, a rod in a radiotherapy machine will lose its strength. As a rod of Cobalt-60 emits an immense blast of radiation, it gradually decays into a stable form of nickel, chemically changing into a completely different element. It takes 5.2714 years for exactly half of the cobalt atoms to decay, otherwise known as a half-life. As all the Cobalt-60 atoms are slowly used up, the radioactivity of a rod of cobalt becomes less fierce. Thereupon, the rod will need to be replaced. But things didn't work out that way in Bangkok. Now, in the case of the rod of Cobalt-60 powering the radiotherapy machine in Bangkok, it was used from 1969 until 1981, 12 years, long after it should have been replaced with a new rod. What this meant for cancer patients at the Bangkok hospital was that they had to spend unreasonably long amounts of time being blasted by an increasingly weak machine in order to shrink their tumors. A new Cobalt-60 rod was installed in the machine in 1981. Thereafter, the pattern repeated itself. The rod was in use for a further 13 years until 1994. Thereupon, the Bangkok hospital replaced the entire radiotherapy machine with a new one manufactured by Nordion, a company based in Canada. It was here that a problem arose. Where do you put the old machine? Nordion refused to take it because they had not manufactured it. Siemens, the German company that did manufacture it in 1969, also refused to take it because they had long since stopped working with Cobalt-60 and no longer produced the machines. So, instead, the Bangkok hospital sold the old machine to the Thai electric company Kharman Sukhasorn, or KSE. As a matter of procedure, the hospital and KSE had to report the transfer of the radioactive device to the Thai nuclear regulator, the Office of Atoms for Peace. But they didn't. That was illegal. The radiotherapy machine was transferred to a KSE warehouse where it was placed in a storage unit that eventually got filled up with 3 other radiotherapy machines when KSE was only licensed to house one of them. In 1999, KSE terminated their lease of the storage warehouse. Thereupon, KSE moved 3 of the radiotherapy machines to a parking lot that they owned in southeast Bangkok. Needless to say, that was also illegal. The radiotherapy machine was stored underneath a simple overhead shelter to protect them from the elements. Otherwise, they were sitting in the open air. Public access was blocked off from the parking lot by only a chain-link fence. However, the neighbored children had long since cut holes in that fence in order to play football in the wide open spaces there. Now, sometime in late 1999 or early 2000, the Bangkok hospital radiotherapy machine was stolen from the parking lot by a person or persons unknown. On January 4th, 2000, the container housing the rod of Cobalt-60 was sold to 2 scrap metal collectors. It is possible these 2 stole the device on their own, but we'll never know. Due to strict defamation laws in Thailand, these men shall remain nameless, as shall all the other players in today's story. They took the container home and left it outside 100 meters or 330 feet from their house, intending to dismantle it and sell the metal at a later date. The Cobalt-60 was at this point 19 years old. The majority of it had already decayed. The original strength of the rod in 1981 was approximately 197 trillion becquerels, a measurement unit for radioactivity named after the man who discovered the phenomenon. By the year 2000, the Cobalt-60's radiation had declined to 15.7 trillion becquerels, a loss of 92% of its potency. But don't be under any illusions here. 15.7 trillion becquerels is roughly as radioactive as the contaminated water that leaked out of the Fukushima plant in the aftermath of the disaster. It's more than enough to kill you if you get close to it. The only silver lining in this situation is that a brand new rod of Cobalt-60 would have killed exponentially more people in the area. Now, on February the 1st, the 2 scrap collectors were joined by 2 other men to try and bust the container open. One was a 23-year-old brother-in-law of one of the collectors, the other was a 19-year-old neighborhood lad just looking to help out. He was the same age as the rod of Carbon-60. For the next hour, they all tried to bust it open, and one of the scrap collectors took a hammer and a chisel to the device. The scrap collector managed to crack a welded seam between the stainless steel exterior and the thick lead container. A toxic, oily liquid came seeping out. This was a buildup of decades of moisture inside the casing that had turned radioactive. Because the scrap collector did the majority of the work, he suffered most of the exposure to it, but the other men were exposed too. At the time, the container of Cobalt-60 remains largely unpenetrated, so it was not as bad as it could have been. At this point, the other scrap metal collector declared that they weren't getting anywhere and proposed to take the device to a junkyard in Samut, Prakan, about 30 minutes drive away. There, the junkyard staff could dismantle the device on site and the scrap collectors could sell the metal to them. This device was loaded onto a motorcycle-driven cart. The impatient scrap collector drove while the 19-year-old youth sat in the cart with his leg dangling over the now cracked and leaking radiotherapy device. The chisel man and the brother-in-law remained at the house and avoided being exposed any further. But the worst was yet to come. Arriving at the junkyard, the scrap collector approached a member of staff and asked him to cut open the steel and lead casing containing the Cobalt-60 with an oxyacetylene welding torch. It burned as hot as 3,500 degrees Celsius or 6,000 Fahrenheit. Another junkyard worker observed the process from just a few feet away. The cutting released a foul-smelling yellow smoke into the air. Part of the lead casing, now cut in half, fell and hit the ground. Unbeknownst to the men, the 1.5-inch long, 1-inch thick rod of Cobalt-60 also fell out and rolled into a nearby pile of scrap. With the rod unleashed, all 4 men in the junkyard were now getting blasted with a potentially fatal dose of radiation. The junkyard worker picked up the 2 pieces of lead casing and weighed them in his hands. His hands immediately began to itch. After putting the pieces down, the junkyard staff member continued to work, trying to separate the stainless steel from the lead, but had already become alarmed by the yellow smoke. The owner of the junkyard, a 45-year-old woman, approached the men and told the scrap collector to take the radiotherapy device home and separate the rest of the lead and the steel there. The 2 pieces of lead that had fallen to the ground were laid to one side. Meanwhile, the rod of Cobalt-60 was left in a pile of scrap in the open air, blasting out radiation into the surrounding neighborhood. It was only 11 feet, or 3.35 meters, from the junkyard owner's office. Not long after the scrap collector left, the 2 junkyard employees got severe headaches and began to vomit. On the drive home, the scrap collector also came down with a splitting headache and began to feel nauseous, but he didn't vomit. His 19-year-old assistant also began to feel ill and felt an itching sensation on his leg where he had draped it over the radiotherapy device on the drive over. Back at the house, the scrap collector and the 19-year-old boy managed to overcome their feelings of illness, and they separated the stainless steel from the rest of the lead. Because the Cobalt-60 was back at the yard, they didn't suffer further exposure in doing so. The scrap collector brought the stainless steel and the lead back to the junkyard for sale the next day on February the 2nd. Meanwhile, the junkyard owner and staff continued to feel the brunt of the radiation from the Cobalt-60 sat right there in the yard. The 2 junkyard employees took some time off to celebrate Chinese New Year, during which they lost weight and had no appetite. They returned to work on February the 7th and continued to be exposed to radiation. The junkyard owner and her husband, who lived across the street and both worked in the office only a few feet away from the Cobalt-60, also continued to be dosed over the next several days, as did the junkyard owner's 33-year-old maid, who worked part-time in the yard, and the owner's 75-year-old mother, who regularly visited her daughter at work. On February the 12th, the junkyard owner grew alarmed at how sick her 2 employees were getting. They were suffering chronic diarrhea, which they could only halt by medication. The owner summoned the scrap collector and told him to take away the lead casing and sell it somewhere else, suspecting that it was the lead that was somehow making her staff sick. She also asked a different scrap collector to throw away the 2 smaller pieces that had hit the ground. The man threw them down a nearby public drain pipe. Meanwhile, the rod of Cobalt-60 remained in the scrap pile in the yard. That same day, on February the 12th, the scrap collector who had gone to the junkyard became distressed at the swollen burns on his hands and had them checked out at a private clinic. No diagnosis was reached, but over the next few days, the burn continued to swell and darken, and the scrap collector began vomiting and losing his hair. On February the 15th, he went to the outpatient clinic at Samut Prakan Hospital, where the doctors took some blood. The scrap collector returned on the 16th with the results and was told that his white blood cell count was alarmingly low, and he was immediately admitted to hospital. Also on the 16th, one of the junkyard staff went to Samut Prakan Hospital with a fever, rapid weight loss, diarrhea, burned hands, and loss of hair. He was examined and immediately admitted as well. The following day, the 17th, the junkyard owner grew distressed at how sick her other employee was getting. He was losing weight and his hair was falling out. The owner drove her second employee to the hospital and he too was admitted. Meanwhile, the owner noticed that a stray dog that frequently wandered into the junkyard was lying there dead. Later, on the 17th, the owner and her husband drove to Bangkok General Hospital. The owner had been feeling weak and noticed her hair had been falling out. Her husband, meanwhile, was also feeling weak, in addition to suffering severe abdominal pain and chronic nosebleeds. The doctors took blood and found their white blood cell count was dangerously low. A bone marrow biopsy was also taken from both of them. The husband was admitted due to his uncontrollable nosebleeds, while the junkyard owner was not admitted but remained as an outpatient at Bangkok Hospital. So, on the morning of February the 18th, at Samut Prakan Hospital, the condition of the scrap collector and the 2 junkyard employees continued to deteriorate. The doctors drew a connection between the symptoms of the 3 patients and concluded that they'd suffered acute radiation poisoning. At 11:10 a.m., they called the Office of Atoms for Peace, who dispatched 2 investigators to Samut, Prakan. They arrived at 12:30 p.m., concurred with the diagnosis, and summoned the junkyard owner from her husband's bedside at Bangkok General to Samut, Prakan for questioning. From there, the investigators went to the public drain pipe to fish out the 2 small pieces of lead. They were no longer emitting any radioactivity. At 7 p.m., the investigators were driving in the direction of the junkyard, still several blocks away, and noticed that radiation levels were spiking to 8 microsieverts per hour, about 20 times normal levels. The investigators continued driving, and when they arrived at the junkyard, the radiation levels in their car spiked to 125 times higher, to 1 millisievert, the same level as fenced-off high radiation areas at a nuclear power plant. The investigators concluded that intense gamma rays were blasting out of the junkyard and called for assistance. The emergency response team arrived and began assessing radiation levels in the area in order to locate the source. The beauty salon on one side of the junkyard and the grocery store on the other side, shielded by walls and fences, were both being blasted with 200 microsieverts of radiation per hour, equivalent to cosmic rays in unshielded interplanetary space. Meanwhile, the buildings across the street from the junkyard were being pelted with unobstructed gamma rays. The radiation was 2 to 4 times higher than the equivalent of a perpetual CT scan running 24 hours a day. The main gate to the junkyard was even worse, hit by 10 millisieverts per hour, or the equivalent of a dose of radiation typically inflicted on a city when a nuclear plant blows up. The junkyard office, being only a few feet from the rod of Cobalt-60, was being hit by 100 millisieverts per hour, or roughly 2,000 times higher than the radiation experienced by a nuclear reactor technician in that same space of time. The biggest dose of radiation was coming from a scrap pile at the front of the yard, 10 full sieverts per hour, almost as bad as what emergency workers experienced at ground zero at Chernobyl, and far beyond the levels of exposure that would result in a 50-50 chance of death in the next 2 months. In fact, 10 full sieverts would typically result in a 99 to 100% mortality rate, even with medical intervention. As such, the emergency response team couldn't get near the pile of scrap in order to locate the source of the radiation. The street was closed to traffic, and the immediate area, 10 meters from the entrance to the junkyard, was cordoned off. But the evacuation of the wider area was deemed unnecessary. There were 1,872 people living within 100 meters or 330 feet of the junkyard, and they were allowed to stay put. Emergency workers continued to narrow down the location of the source of the radiation throughout the night until 4 a.m. on February the 19th, when operations were suspended as they formulated a plan to remove the source from the scrap pile. Meanwhile, the junkyard owner's maid was admitted to hospital with nausea, vomiting, and headache. The condition of the 2 junkyard workers continued to worsen. Their white cell count dropped to near zero. They had radiation burns all over their arms, chests, and faces. They had fever, nosebleeds that required nasal packing to staunch the flow, and their lips and tongues had become painfully swollen. Back at the junkyard, at 4 p.m., the source removal plan was put into action. A mechanical excavator tore down the fence at the front of the yard. A bulldozer was rigged up with spotlights and a lead shield that was 6.5 feet tall and 2 inches thick to allow emergency workers to hide behind it in an effort to get closer to the scrap pile. The workers did not have hazmat suits, but wore cloth gloves and face masks, which were practically useless. Some of the workers also insisted on wearing lead aprons, which are appropriate for dentists during an X-ray, but they offered next to no protection from the immense amount of radiation being blasted out by the Cobalt-60. In fact, the aprons slowed the workers' movements, increasing the risk of exposure. Yet the officials in charge of the emergency response team allowed the workers to wear the lead aprons as a sort of security blanket to allay their fears and keep them calm. Large pieces of scrap were taken away from the pile with a mechanical grasping tool. Smaller pieces of scrap were removed by an improvised 16-foot bamboo pole with an electromagnet tied to the end. One by one, pieces of scrap were removed, dropped into an old bathtub with a radiation scanner in it, and assessed as to whether the scrap was the source. Next to the bathtub was a 3.3-inch thick lead container into which the source would be dropped once it was found. With the larger pieces of overhanging scrap removed from the pile, the workers could still not figure out which piece of material was emitting the radiation. After nightfall, they decided to bring in fluorescent screens to figure out which piece of material was glowing like a Christmas tree. However, even with the searchlights turned off, the moon was so bright that it made it difficult to read the screen. Finally, at 9 p.m., there was enough cloud cover to figure out the source of the radiation, and it was a small object, just 1.5 inches long. Some more scrap was cleared, and after some difficulty in grasping the object without getting a fatal dose of radiation, at 12:20 a.m. on February the 20th, the workers finally managed to pick up the Cobalt-60 with the bamboo rod and the electromagnet at the end. It was dropped into the lead container and then sealed. The container was then shipped off for safe handling and storage. Despite shoddy and makeshift equipment. The emergency response team managed to pull it off without getting a heavy dose of radiation. At the uppermost, 6 of the volunteers received the equivalent of a full-body CT scan, while the remaining 46 emergency workers received considerably less. As ramshackle as the effort may seem, the lead shield and the grappling tools were a success. A few hours later, on February the 20th, authorities located the second scrap collector, the chisel man who had initially cracked the welded seam, and took him to Samut Prakan hospital. His white blood cell count was low, and his hands were swollen bright reds and looked as if they were half-melted candles. The 19-year-old lad who had draped his leg over the radiotherapy machine on the way to the junkyard was also located. Predictably, the young man had a severe radiation burn down the back of his right leg, stretching from the thigh to the calf. The skin was falling off and slowly becoming necrotic, risking a grisly infection. There was a second burn, 10 inches in diameter, on his right knee. He also had suffered radiation burns to some of his fingers, and as with the others, he was running low on white blood cells. The junkyard owner was admitted to hospital on the 20th, was accordingly treated for low white blood cells, and later treated for fever and a rectal bleed. She also suffered vascular deterioration and damage to her lungs, but thankfully, with regular blood transfusions and antibiotics, she did not require invasive surgery or a respirator. By the end of March, she had made a full recovery. The junkyard owner's mother was admitted to hospital on February the 22nd. She had been suffering nausea, fever, and a low white blood cell count. The brother-in-law of one of the scrap collectors wasn't located until March the 3rd. He had only been present during the hammer and chisel stage. Nevertheless, he had sustained radiation burns to his right hand, and the nails on his middle finger and pinky had fallen off. The 2 scrap collectors, the brother-in-law, the 19-year-old, the junkyard owner, her maid, and her mother, spent about a month in hospital and eventually made full recoveries. The others weren't so lucky. The 2 junkyard workers, who had received the full brunt of the Cobalt-60 when they'd cut open the lead container and worked in the yard for a further week with the Cobalt-60 right there, slowly killed them. The junkyard worker, who had actually cut open the container, could not recover his white blood cell count. Open sores began appearing in his mouth and on his tongue, and large segments of his skin began falling off. He got severe diarrhea again on the 2nd of March, and by March the 6th he could no longer eat food and had to be fed through a tube. On the 15th, his lungs began to shut down and he was hooked up to a respirator. On the 17th, he fell into a coma. It was the low white blood cell count and infection that got him in the end. And on March the 18th, he died of sepsis. The other junkyard worker suffered intense fever. His hair almost completely fell out and open sores began appearing in his mouth and on the sides of his head. By March the 17th, he was no longer able to eat or breathe. He began bleeding in his gastrointestinal tract. On March the 9th, he went into septic shock, suffered a seizure, his heart stopped, defibrillation didn't work, and he died that evening. Finally, the junkyard owner's husband developed hives over his back from a fungal infection, fell into a dangerously high fever, and his white cell count could not be improved. He was put on a respirator on March 22nd as liquid began to fill his lungs, and on the morning of March 24th, his heart gave out from the stress of his many symptoms. All told, the regular junkyard staff were the worst hit by the radiation due to the fact that they were exposed to the open-air Cobalt-60 whenever they were on site between February the 1st and the 17th. It's estimated that the 2 junkyard workers, the junkyard owner and her husband, were hit with approximately 6 to 8 grays, which is the measurement unit for the amount of radiation that has been absorbed by the body. The impact on the maid and mother was less severe because they were only there part-time. Bear in mind that 5 grays gives you a 50-50 chance of dying in the next 2 months. So the fact that the junkyard owner survived at all when the other 3 men died is something of a miracle. It's likely due to the fact that she didn't work outside her office as often as her 2 employees and her husband. Not that the nuclear reactor levels of radiation in her office were by any means safe. Meanwhile, the 2 scrap collectors, the brother-in-law and the 19-year-old, were hit by 1 to 3 grays. By 1 to 3 grays, with medical intervention, there's a 5 to 30% chance you'll die in the next 2 months. Most of their symptoms were burns, where they'd handled the radiotherapy device in their attempts to open and transport it. Despite low white blood cell counts, they all made full recoveries. As for the 1,872 people who lived within 100 meters or 330 feet of the junkyard, they had received a range of doses equivalent to being blasted by cosmic rays in outer space, to getting multiple CT scans, to a bad sunburn, all of which would increase their risks of cancer in later life. 862 of them were checked out by doctors, 782 of them had their blood taken, 907 of them received government advice. The other half of them got nothing. 5 pregnant women lived within 50 meters or 165 feet. One of them decided to have an abortion, feeling that the radiation might cause the child to be born with mutations. KSE, the electricity company who had initially stored the radiotherapy device in a parking lot along with 2 other machines, was initially fined just $450. In 2003, the Office of Atoms for Peace was sued in a class action lawsuit for failing to keep track of the whereabouts of a nuclear device after its removal from the KSE warehouse. The dozen plaintiffs won $155,000 in compensation. That's the average salary of about 4 people in Thailand. In 2007, the, quite frankly, bigger culprit, KSE, was sued in a civil suit and had to pay a further $19,000 to the victims of the disaster. That was all the compensation anyone received. Nor can it be said that this was the last incident of nuclear materials being unleashed on the Thai public as a result of industrial negligence and lack of regulatory oversight. The most positive thing to come out of the incident was the introduction of hazard symbol number 21482. After much institutional humming and hawing, a full 7 years later, it was released. But with any luck, it shall encourage anyone who finds themselves in a similar situation to the scrap collectors and the junkyard workers to drop what they're doing and run. Run for their goddamn lives.